When an empath stops chasing an avoidant, everything changes. Not because a dramatic conversation finally happens, not because someone suddenly figures everything out, and not because love disappears overnight. It changes because one day, almost without warning, the person who has been carrying the emotional weight of the relationship simply puts it down. There is no announcement, no final speech, no grand exit, just a quiet shift that happens deep inside. The messages become less frequent. The urge to explain fades, the constant effort to keep the connection alive slowly dissolves. And what makes this moment so powerful is that most people think the avoidant will finally get exactly what they wanted: space, freedom, relief. Yet what often happens next is something neither person expects, because when the chase ends, the entire dynamic that held the relationship together begins to unravel, exposing truths that were hidden beneath years of pursuit and distance. If you've ever found yourself loving someone who seemed to move further away the closer you got, then stay with me, because what happens next might explain parts of your own story that never made sense before. And while you're here, make sure to subscribe. Consider it your way of helping this little corner of the internet continue decoding the mysteries of human connection before another empath accidentally sends a 12-paragraph text that should have stayed in the drafts. The strange thing about empaths is that they rarely begin chasing because they are desperate. In the beginning, it comes from something that feels beautiful. They genuinely care, they notice emotional shifts others miss, they sense pain beneath silence. They see walls and immediately wonder what hurt built them. Where other people might step back, the empath steps closer. They believe connection can heal. They believe patience can soften defenses. They believe understanding can create safety. So when an avoidant pulls away, the empath doesn't interpret it as rejection. They interpret it as a signal that more love is needed, more reassurance, more consistency, more effort. They become emotional detectives searching for the perfect combination of words that will finally unlock intimacy. Every cold response becomes a puzzle to solve. Every withdrawal becomes a challenge to overcome. They convince themselves that if they can just love a little harder, communicate a little better, or prove their loyalty a little more clearly, everything will eventually fall into place. What they don't realize is that somewhere along the way, empathy quietly transforms into overfunctioning. Instead of participating in a relationship, they begin managing it. Instead of receiving love, they begin working for it. And because their intentions are rooted in genuine care, they often fail to notice how much of themselves they are sacrificing in the process. On the other side of this dynamic stands the avoidant, often misunderstood by nearly everyone, including themselves. Contrary to popular belief, most avoidants are not running because they don't care. In many cases, they care deeply. The problem is that closeness activates fears they rarely discuss. Intimacy demands vulnerability, and vulnerability feels dangerous. Depending on others feels risky. Being fully seen can feel overwhelming, so they find themselves trapped in an exhausting internal conflict. Part of them wants connection, part of them fears it. They enjoy emotional closeness until it starts feeling too real. They crave love until it begins requiring emotional exposure. And when those fears activate, distance becomes their coping mechanism. They pull back not necessarily because they want to leave, but because they need relief from the discomfort intimacy creates inside them. Unfortunately, the more they withdraw, the more the empath pursues. The more the empath pursues, the more pressure the avoidant feels. And the more pressure the avoidant feels, the further they retreat. Neither person usually understands what is happening. Each believes they are responding logically to the other's behavior. Yet beneath the surface, an invisible dance is forming. One that neither partner consciously chose, but both continue reinforcing every single day. Over time, this dynamic becomes strangely addictive, not because it feels good, but because it becomes familiar. The empath learns that periods of distance are often followed by moments of reconnection. Those brief moments of closeness feel incredibly rewarding because they arrive after emotional deprivation. A single affectionate message suddenly feels worth weeks of uncertainty. A small sign of effort feels enormous because expectations have been lowered over time. Meanwhile, the avoidant grows accustomed to the certainty that the empath will always be there. No matter how distant they become, someone continues reaching out, someone continues understanding, someone continues fighting for the relationship. Without realizing it, both people become attached to their roles. The empath becomes the pursuer, the avoidant becomes the distancer. And because these roles repeat so consistently, they begin to feel normal. The relationship starts revolving around pursuit and withdrawal rather than mutual connection. Conversations become reactions instead of authentic exchanges. Emotional energy is spent managing the cycle rather than building intimacy. Yet because this pattern develops gradually, neither person recognizes how deeply trapped they have become. They mistake familiarity for stability. They mistake repetition for progress. They keep hoping the next conversation, the next breakthrough, or the next promise will finally change everything. But the cycle survives precisely because both people keep participating in it. Eventually, however, something happens that changes the entire story. The empath becomes tired. Not the kind of tired that disappears after a good night's sleep. This is a deeper exhaustion, the exhaustion of constantly wondering where they stand. The exhaustion of carrying hope through disappointment after disappointment. The exhaustion of being emotionally available while feeling emotionally alone. At first they try harder, then they try differently, then they try less, until one day they arrive at a realization that quietly breaks something open inside them. They understand that no amount of effort can create intimacy on behalf of two people. They understand that love cannot thrive on pursuit alone. They understand that constantly chasing someone is not proof of devotion. It may actually be proof that their own needs have been ignored for far too long. And so, without anger or revenge, they begin letting go. Not because they stopped caring. In many ways, they still care deeply. But they can no longer continue sacrificing themselves in exchange for occasional moments of connection. They stop initiating every conversation. They stop overanalyzing every silence. They stop trying to rescue a relationship that requires mutual participation. What makes this moment so significant is that the avoidant often doesn't recognize its importance right away. To them, it may initially look like ordinary distance, another pause, another temporary shift. But beneath the surface, something irreversible has begun. For the first time in a very long time, the empath is no longer running after the relationship. And once that happens, everything changes. At first, the silence feels almost invisible. Nothing dramatic announces its arrival. Days pass much like they always have. The avoidant continues with their routine, assuming the familiar pattern will eventually restart itself. After all, it always has before. The distance never felt permanent because there was always someone bridging the gap. There was always a message waiting, always a conversation being reopened, always an emotional hand reaching across the growing space between them. But this time something feels different. The silence is no longer filled with expectation. It isn't a pause before another attempt. It isn't a temporary withdrawal before renewed effort. The energy behind it has changed. And even if the avoidant cannot immediately identify why, they begin to sense it. The relationship suddenly feels quieter in a way that cannot be explained by a busy schedule or a few missed conversations. There is an absence where certainty used to exist. The emotional background noise that once surrounded the connection has disappeared. What makes this so unsettling is that the avoidant may have spent months or even years believing they wanted more space. Yet when that space finally arrives without conditions attached, it carries a strange emotional weight. The silence no longer feels like freedom. It feels like something important may no longer be reaching for them. This is often the point where unexpected discomfort begins to surface. Many people assume avoidants feel immediate relief when pursuit stops, but human emotions are rarely that simple. Relief may appear briefly, but it is often followed by confusion. The nervous system that became accustomed to someone's consistent presence suddenly notices the absence. The messages that once felt predictable are gone. The emotional availability that seemed guaranteed is no longer waiting in the background. And without realizing it, the avoidant starts paying attention in ways they hadn't before. They may check their phone more often. They may wonder why there hasn't been contact. They may find themselves thinking about conversations they previously dismissed. This isn't necessarily because they have suddenly transformed into a different person. It is because certainty has been replaced by uncertainty. For perhaps the first time, they can no longer assume the relationship will continue existing exactly as it always has. The emotional safety net they unconsciously relied upon begins to feel less permanent. And with that realization comes a feeling they have spent much of their life trying to avoid: vulnerability. Because as long as someone is chasing you, you never have to confront what losing them would actually feel like. But once the chase ends, that question becomes impossible to ignore. While the avoidant wrestles with unfamiliar emotions, something equally important is happening on the other side. The empath is beginning to reclaim energy that has been tied up in the relationship for far too long. At first, the process feels uncomfortable. They have spent so much time focusing outward that turning inward feels unnatural. There are moments when they want to reach out, moments when old habits whisper that one more effort might finally change everything. But gradually, something remarkable begins to happen. The emotional resources once spent analyzing someone else's behavior become available for their own growth. The hours spent waiting for responses become opportunities for self-discovery. The mental space previously occupied by uncertainty starts filling with clarity. They reconnect with forgotten interests, they strengthen neglected friendships, they revisit dreams that had quietly been pushed aside. Most importantly, they begin remembering who they were before the relationship became the center of their emotional universe. This doesn't happen overnight. Healing rarely does. But each day they spend investing in themselves instead of chasing validation creates a subtle shift in their identity. Their self-worth slowly detaches from another person's ability to reciprocate. Their happiness becomes less dependent on external reassurance. And for the first time in a very long while, peace begins replacing emotional turbulence. What many empaths don't realize is that they often serve as emotional mirrors within relationships. Their presence absorbs tension, initiates difficult conversations, offers understanding, and creates opportunities for emotional processing. Even when the avoidant appears distant, the empath is frequently doing invisible work behind the scenes, helping regulate the connection. Once they step away from that role, the landscape changes dramatically. Suddenly, the avoidant is left alone with emotions that were previously softened by someone else's efforts. The distractions that once made discomfort manageable become less effective. Feelings that were easy to postpone become harder to ignore. Old wounds that remained buried beneath constant relationship dynamics begin surfacing in quiet moments. The empath is no longer there to interpret every silence, repair every misunderstanding, or absorb every emotional impact. And this creates a mirror of a different kind. Instead of reflecting the avoidant's feelings back with compassion and reassurance, reality begins reflecting them directly. The loneliness that distance once protected them from starts feeling more tangible. The fears they kept at arm's length become more visible. They are confronted not by another person's demands, but by their own unresolved emotional world. And sometimes that experience is far more uncomfortable than intimacy itself. As the weeks or months continue, something unexpected often emerges. Memory begins rewriting the narrative. Human beings have a fascinating tendency to overlook value when it is constantly available and recognize it only after it is gone. The avoidant starts remembering details that seemed ordinary at the time, small acts of care, moments of patience, conversations that provided comfort during difficult periods. They remember feeling understood. They remember feeling accepted despite their flaws. They remember having someone who consistently chose them even when the relationship was complicated. What once blended into the background now stands out with surprising clarity. Nostalgia enters quietly, not as a dramatic realization but as a series of emotional echoes. A song, a familiar place, a random moment during an ordinary day. Each reminder carries a subtle question. Was that connection more meaningful than I allowed myself to believe? This is where the avoidant often discovers one of the most difficult truths of all. Distance can make flaws appear smaller, but it can also reveal value that was previously taken for granted. The absence of the empath creates a contrast that highlights everything they contributed to the relationship. And because those contributions were often emotional rather than tangible, they become especially noticeable once they are no longer present. The person who once seemed endlessly available now feels strangely far away. The connection that seemed guaranteed now feels uncertain. And for perhaps the first time, the avoidant begins looking back not at what felt overwhelming, but at what was quietly precious all along. And that is the moment the balance begins to change. Not through manipulation, not through games, not because the empath suddenly learns some secret technique designed to make the avoidant come running back. The shift happens because the foundation of the relationship is no longer resting on one person's effort. For so long, the emotional scales were tilted in a single direction. One person was pursuing clarity while the other controlled distance. One person was carrying uncertainty while the other maintained space. But now, the dynamic that once felt permanent is quietly rearranging itself. The empath is no longer seeking constant reassurance. They are no longer measuring their worth through another person's responses. They are no longer organizing their emotional world around someone else's availability. And because of that, the avoidant finds themselves standing in unfamiliar territory. The certainty that once existed has disappeared. The relationship is no longer being actively sustained by the same source of energy. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant is experiencing what the empath carried for so long: uncertainty. They do not know what the other person is thinking. They do not know whether the connection still exists in the same form. They do not know if they still occupy the same place in someone's heart. What makes this shift so powerful is that nobody announced it. Nobody demanded it. It emerged naturally when one person stopped giving more than they were receiving, and once that happens, the emotional gravity of the relationship begins pulling in a completely different direction. Meanwhile, the empath continues moving through a transformation that is far deeper than simply ending a pursuit. They stop waiting, not in the dramatic sense that movies often portray, but in the quiet, life-changing way that alters daily existence. They stop checking their phone every few minutes. They stop creating imaginary conversations in their mind. They stop interpreting every social media update as hidden meaning. They stop living in a future that may never arrive and begin returning to the present moment. This stage often feels surprisingly emotional because waiting had become such a significant part of their routine. They had been waiting for consistency, waiting for commitment, waiting for vulnerability, waiting for proof that their efforts mattered. When they finally release those expectations, there is a strange mixture of grief and freedom. Grief because they must let go of the version of the relationship they hoped would exist. Freedom because they are no longer trapped by that hope. Slowly, they begin experiencing life without constantly carrying emotional suspense. Their happiness becomes less dependent on outcomes they cannot control. Their nervous system, which spent so much time operating in uncertainty, starts learning what calm feels like again. And perhaps most importantly, they begin understanding that peace is not something another person gives them. It is something they create when they stop abandoning themselves in pursuit of connection. Ironically, it is often at this exact point that the avoidant becomes increasingly curious. Human psychology is fascinating in this way. Certainty rarely demands attention. It simply exists in the background. But uncertainty has a way of pulling focus. The avoidant starts noticing things that once went unquestioned. They wonder why the familiar patterns have disappeared. They wonder what changed. They wonder whether the empath has moved on emotionally. Questions begin replacing assumptions. Before, they assumed the connection would always remain available regardless of how much distance existed. Now they no longer know. And that lack of knowledge creates a new emotional experience. Curiosity is not always about romance. Sometimes it is about realizing a reality you once depended on may no longer be guaranteed. The avoidant may replay old conversations in their mind. They may revisit memories that suddenly feel more meaningful than before. They may find themselves wanting information they previously avoided seeking. What is especially important here is that the empath is often no longer trying to create this reaction. In fact, many have become focused on their own healing. The curiosity emerges not because someone is strategically withdrawing, but because genuine detachment creates an emotional vacuum where certainty used to live, and the human mind naturally wants to understand what has changed. As curiosity deepens, something even more significant begins to surface. The avoidant is forced to confront a conflict they may have spent years avoiding. There is a profound difference between fearing intimacy and fearing loss. For much of the relationship, intimacy felt like the greater threat. Closeness triggered vulnerability. Dependence triggered discomfort. Emotional exposure triggered anxiety. Distance provided relief. But now another fear enters the picture. The fear that the connection may actually disappear. The fear that someone who once waited may no longer be waiting. The fear that opportunities can expire. This internal conflict is rarely visible from the outside. Many avoidants continue appearing calm and composed while wrestling with intense emotions beneath the surface. Part of them still wants protection. Part of them suddenly recognizes what protection may cost. The emotional walls that once felt necessary begin creating consequences that can no longer be ignored. And this is where many avoidants encounter a painful realization. Keeping someone at a safe distance does not guarantee they will remain there forever. Every relationship exists within time. Every opportunity for connection has limits. Every person has a threshold beyond which they can no longer continue sacrificing themselves. The avoidant begins recognizing that loss is not merely a theoretical possibility. It is a real outcome. And unlike intimacy, which once felt overwhelming because it involved vulnerability, loss feels overwhelming because it involves finality. Perhaps the most surprising development of all is what happens to the empath during this process. Without intending to, they often become more attractive than they were during the pursuit phase. Not because they changed their appearance, not because they adopted a new personality, but because something fundamental has shifted inside them. Neediness has been replaced by self-respect. Anxiety has been replaced by groundedness. Constant availability has been replaced by healthy boundaries. There is a quiet confidence that emerges when someone stops trying to convince another person to choose them. They begin carrying themselves differently. Their energy changes, their conversations change, their presence changes. The empath who once felt consumed by uncertainty now appears centered within themselves. And paradoxically, this independence often creates the very attraction that endless chasing never could. The avoidant sees someone who is no longer orbiting around the relationship, someone who is no longer waiting for permission to live fully, someone who has discovered value within themselves rather than seeking it externally. But what makes this transformation so meaningful is that the empath is no longer doing it for anyone else's attention. They are not becoming stronger in hopes of being noticed. They are becoming stronger because they finally understand their own worth. And that realization changes everything. Because when an empath reaches the point where they genuinely believe they will be okay with or without the relationship, they step into a level of emotional freedom that cannot be taken away. And once that freedom appears, the story enters its most important chapter yet.